A lesson in kindness. The high school cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime chaos, the clatter of trays, bursts of laughter, and countless conversations blending into a familiar symphony. Among the sea of students sat a quiet sophomore, who always chose the corner table near the window. She wasn't trying to hide. She just preferred the peaceful spot where sunlight streamed in, warming her worn-out sweater. Life hadn't been easy lately. Her family had fallen on hard times after her mother's medical bills started piling up. She qualified for the free lunch program, but using the special lunch card always made her feel self-conscious. Most days, she tried to move through the lunch line as quickly and quietly as possible. That Tuesday seemed like any other until she reached the front of the line. The new cafeteria worker, a stern-faced woman with streaks of gray in her hair, squinted at the lunch card. Her lips curled into a disapproving frown. "Another free lunch, kid," she muttered, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Must be nice getting handouts while everyone else has to pay." The girl's cheeks burned as several heads turned in her direction. She wanted to disappear, to drop her tray and run. But she stood frozen, her hunger fighting against her humiliation. What the cafeteria worker didn't know was that the girl's father wasn't just any parent. He was the newly appointed superintendent of the entire school district, a fact he'd kept quiet to let his daughter have a normal school experience. He'd worked his way up from being a teacher in the same district, starting in the city's toughest schools, and had only recently accepted the position. He'd chosen to keep their connection private, wanting his daughter to make her own way without special treatment. But he'd also taught her something important. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. That evening at home, the girl finally broke down and told her father about the incident. Her voice trembled as she described the whispers and stares that followed her for the rest of the day. She expected him to be angry, to storm into school the next day throwing his authority around. Instead, he sat quietly, listening to every word. When she finished, he pulled her into a warm hug and said, "Sometimes people judge without understanding, but we can choose how we respond." Together, they came up with a plan, not for revenge, but for change. A plan that would transform not just one cafeteria worker's attitude, but the entire school's approach to student dignity and food security. The next day would bring surprises that nobody in the school saw coming. But for now, father and daughter sat at their kitchen table, sharing a simple dinner and mapping out a future where no student would feel ashamed about needing help with lunch. Little did the cafeteria worker know, her thoughtless comments were about to spark a movement that would ripple through the entire school district, touching lives in ways she never could have imagined. The next morning, the superintendent walked into school alongside his daughter, dressed not in his usual suit, but in casual clothes. He signed in as a volunteer lunch server, something he'd arranged with the principal the night before. Nobody except the principal knew his true role in the district. The cafeteria worker from yesterday did a double take when she saw him put on an apron and hairnet. "Are you new?" she asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "Just volunteering," he smiled warmly. "I believe it's important to understand how our schools work from every angle." Throughout the lunch period, he worked alongside the cafeteria staff, learning their challenges firsthand. He noticed how the rushed pace made it difficult to be friendly, how the aging equipment constantly broke down, and how some students tried to hide their free lunch cards under their sleeves. During a quiet moment, he struck up a conversation with the stern cafeteria worker. "Pretty busy here, isn't it?" he said, helping her restock the napkins. "Always is," she sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "Been doing this for 15 years. Used to be different. We had more staff, better equipment. Now everything's about cutting costs." As they talked, she opened up about her own struggles, how her son had once relied on free lunches when she was a single mom, how ashamed she'd felt back then. Her voice cracked as she spoke about those difficult years. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly, "I forget what it was like. Yesterday I wasn't kind to a student. Been feeling terrible about it." The superintendent nodded thoughtfully. We all have moments we wish we could take back. The question is, what do we do next? By the end of the lunch period, something had shifted. The cafeteria worker's usual frown had softened. She even smiled at a few students, something her coworkers couldn't remember seeing before. That afternoon, she pulled the superintendent's daughter aside. "About yesterday," she began, her eyes meeting the girls. "I was wrong. Dead wrong. Sometimes life gets hard, and we all need help sometimes. I of all people should know that." The girl smiled, remembering her father's words about choosing how to respond. "Thank you," she said simply. The following week, changes began rolling out across the district. New systems were implemented allowing students to pay for lunch through their student IDs, making it impossible to tell who was on the free lunch program. The cafeteria got updated equipment, and additional staff was hired to help during rush periods. But the biggest change wasn't in the policies or equipment. It was in the atmosphere. The cafeteria worker, who had once been known for her stern demeanor, became an advocate for student dignity. She started a support group for students facing food insecurity, sharing her own story of overcoming hardship. When the superintendent's identity was finally revealed at a school board meeting months later, the cafeteria worker was in the audience. She wasn't surprised. She'd figured it out weeks ago. But she stood up and shared how one day of working alongside him had changed her perspective forever. The story spread throughout the district, not as a tale of revenge or humiliation, but as a reminder that everyone deserves kindness, understanding, and second chances. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from our most difficult moments, and the biggest changes start with a single act of compassion. The superintendent's daughter still sits at her sunny corner table, but now she's rarely alone. Her quiet strength and forgiveness turned her into a leader in her own right, showing that true power isn't about authority. It's about how we treat each other when things get tough. 1 year later, the high school cafeteria had become an entirely different place. The once dreaded lunch hour was now something students looked forward to. The transformation went far beyond just new equipment and shorter lines. It was about the spirit of the place. The cafeteria worker who had once made that harsh comment had become everyone's favorite lunch server. Students called her Lunch Lady Angel because she always seemed to know who needed an extra helping or just a kind word. She kept a special eye out for kids who reminded her of herself years ago, when she was struggling as a single mom. The superintendent's daughter, now a junior, had started a peer support program called Lunch Buddies. The idea was simple but powerful. Students would sign up to share lunch with someone new each week. It wasn't about charity or pity. It was about breaking down the invisible walls that often divided students based on their backgrounds. One day, a new student arrived mid-semester. Everyone could see his nervousness as he clutched his free lunch card, looking lost in the crowded cafeteria. Before anyone could say a word, 3 students from different social circles waved him over to their table. They didn't know if he was on free lunch or not. With the new system, nobody could tell. And more importantly, nobody cared. The superintendent would often stop by for lunch, not as the district head, but as a regular visitor who enjoyed talking with students and staff. He'd sit at different tables each time, listening to students' ideas about making their school even better. His daughter would smile, remembering how a moment of humiliation had turned into something so meaningful. The cafeteria worker's story had spread to other schools in the district, inspiring similar changes. She was invited to speak at education conferences, sharing her journey from judgment to understanding. "Sometimes our worst moments lead us to our best changes," she would say, her voice strong with conviction. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during graduation that year. The senior class had chosen the cafeteria worker as their special speaker, an honor usually reserved for distinguished alumni or local celebrities. As she stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly, she looked out at the sea of faces. "A year ago," she began, "I thought I knew everything about strength. I thought being tough meant being hard. But you all taught me that real strength is having the courage to be kind, to admit when we're wrong, and to help others even when we're struggling ourselves." She spoke about how a single incident had opened her eyes to her own prejudices and how the students had taught her more than she could ever teach them. By the end of her speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. The superintendent's daughter sat in her graduation gown, thinking about how different things could have been if her father had responded with anger instead of wisdom that day. One small choice had created ripples of change that would continue long after she left these halls. The story of the cafeteria incident still gets told at school orientation each year, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that every person who walks through those doors has their own story, their own struggles, and their own strength. It's become more than just a school legend. It's a living example of how understanding and compassion can transform a community. As the superintendent's daughter prepared to head off to college that fall, she left behind a legacy that had nothing to do with her father's position and everything to do with the power of responding to unkindness with grace. The sunny corner table where she used to sit alone became known as the welcome table, always open to anyone who needed a friend or a reminder that they belonged. 5 years later, the young college graduate walked through the familiar doors of her old high school cafeteria. The superintendent's daughter, now a successful education consultant, had been invited back to see how the small revolution she helped start had grown into something extraordinary. The old welcome table by the sunny window had multiplied. Now every table in the cafeteria had a small golden sunburst painted in its center, marking it as a place where everyone belonged. Students of all backgrounds sat together, sharing stories and laughter over their meals. The former cafeteria worker, now the district's student welfare coordinator, had transformed the free lunch program across the entire school system. Her office walls were covered with letters from students and parents whose lives she touched. She created a network of support that went far beyond just providing meals. It was about nurturing dignity and hope. "Remember that day?" she asked, as they both stood watching the lunchtime buzz. "I thought I was just having a bad day when I made that comment. I never imagined it would change my entire life's purpose." The school had become a model for others across the country. Educators from different states would visit to learn how a simple change in the cafeteria had sparked a transformation in school culture. They'd leave with more than just policy ideas. They'd take with them a new understanding of how compassion could reshape a community. The superintendent, now nearing retirement, still came to serve lunch once a month. He'd noticed how this simple act kept him connected to what really mattered in education, the daily experiences of students and staff. His daughter watched him chatting with a shy freshman, remembering how he'd taught her that leadership wasn't about power, but about understanding. During her visit, a student journalist approached to interview her for the school paper. "What's the most important lesson from your story?" the young reporter asked, notebook ready. She thought for a moment, looking around at the bustling cafeteria. "You know, people often think this story is about forgiveness or about standing up to bullying. But it's really about something simpler. It's about choosing to see the best in people, even when they're not showing it to you." The changes had rippled out in unexpected ways. The school's academic performance had improved significantly. Teachers noted that students who felt supported during lunch were more focused in class. Attendance rates were up, and behavioral issues had dropped dramatically. But the most profound change was in the small, everyday moments. Like when a new student would walk in, looking lost and afraid, only to be immediately welcomed by others. Or when students would instinctively share their lunch with someone who forgot theirs, no questions asked. The Lunch Buddies program she'd started had evolved into a district-wide mentorship initiative. Senior students would guide freshmen through their first year, sharing meals and wisdom. The program had even caught the attention of national education organizations. As she prepared to leave, she stopped by her old sunny corner. A group of students sat there, deeply engaged in conversation. One of them looked up and smiled, not knowing they were sitting with the person who had started it all. "Would you like to join us?" the student asked warmly. She sat down, feeling the familiar warmth of the sun through the window. As she listened to their stories and dreams, she realized that the most powerful changes often start with the smallest moments of kindness. Every day, in this cafeteria and beyond, new stories of understanding and compassion were being written. Before leaving, she left a note on the welcome table, not signing her name, just a simple message. Sometimes the hardest moments lead us to the most beautiful changes. Keep the kindness going. The story of the cafeteria incident was no longer just about one moment of conflict and its resolution. It had become a living testament to how a community can grow stronger through understanding, and how one person's choice to respond to unkindness with grace could create waves of positive change that continue to ripple outward, touching lives for generations to come. 10 years after that life-changing incident in the school cafeteria, the impact had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The story had become more than just a local legend. It had sparked a nationwide movement in school culture and community building. The superintendent's daughter, now a leading voice in educational reform, often found herself speaking at national conferences. But instead of focusing on policies and procedures, she would tell the simple story of a cafeteria worker, a lunch card, and how a moment of hurt became a catalyst for change. The most powerful part wasn't the programs we created, she would explain to packed audiences. It was how people started looking at each other differently. When you realize that everyone you meet is fighting their own battles, it changes how you treat them. The former cafeteria worker had written a book about her experience. Not a story of shame or regret, but one of transformation and hope. The book wasn't just about school lunches. It was about how communities could heal and grow stronger through understanding and second chances. One chapter described how a middle school student had read the story and started a kitchen table talks program in his neighborhood. Every weekend, families would take turns hosting dinners where people from different backgrounds could share meals and stories. The simple act of breaking bread together was breaking down walls that had stood for generations. The welcome table concept had spread to businesses, community centers, and even government offices. People would designate spaces where anyone could sit and find a friendly face. These tables became known as places where strangers became friends and where problems found solutions through conversation and understanding. A popular documentary filmmaker had visited the original high school to capture the story's legacy. What struck them most wasn't the official programs or the awards the school had won. It was the everyday moments of kindness they witnessed. Students automatically making room at their tables, sharing snacks, and looking out for each other without being asked. During the filming, they caught a beautiful moment. A new student had dropped their lunch tray, food scattering everywhere. Before tears could even form, a dozen students rushed to help. Someone shared their lunch, and another went to get a fresh tray. The filmmaker later said they didn't include this scene because it happened so naturally it looked staged. The superintendent, now retired, had become a beloved figure in the community, not for his policies or programs, but for showing how true leadership means getting your hands dirty and leading by example. He still volunteered in school cafeterias, saying it kept him grounded and reminded him of what really mattered. His daughter had married now, and her own children attended the same high school. They knew the story, not because of their mother's fame, but because it was woven into the school's culture. Every student who walked through those doors learned that kindness wasn't just a nice idea. It was a way of life. One day, while visiting the school, she overheard a student explaining to another why everyone was so friendly in the cafeteria. "It's simple," the student said. "We all have our tough days. But here, we choose to help each other through them." The story had even influenced school architecture. New schools were being designed with cafeterias that emphasized community and connection. Gone were the long, institutional tables. Instead, spaces were created where students could easily talk, share, and support each other. As she watched her own children navigate high school life, she saw how the legacy of that difficult day lived on. They didn't know that their mother was the girl from the story, and she preferred it that way. What mattered wasn't who started the change, but how everyone chose to carry it forward. The final scene in the documentary showed students from different schools video chatting during lunch, sharing stories, and building friendships across districts. The cafeteria workers' harsh words from a decade ago had transformed into a symphony of laughter, understanding, and connection that echoed far beyond those school walls. Sometimes, she wrote in her journals, life's hardest moments are just the beginning of its most beautiful chapters. All it takes is one person choosing kindness over anger, understanding over judgment, and hope over hurt. 20 years after that fateful day in the cafeteria, the story had become a timeless lesson taught in schools of education across the country. But its real power wasn't in textbooks or training programs. It lived in the countless lives it had touched and the changes it had inspired. The superintendent's daughter, now with gray streaks in her hair, stood before a gathering of international educators. They hadn't come to hear about policies or programs. They'd come to understand how a single moment of hardship in a high school cafeteria had grown into a global movement of compassion. The most beautiful part, she told them, her voice soft but strong, is how this story keeps writing new chapters through other people's actions. Every day, somewhere in the world, someone chooses kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment. The original cafeteria worker, now in her golden years, had become known as the grandmother of school culture. She spent her retirement visiting schools, not to give formal speeches, but to sit with students during lunch and share stories. Her presence alone reminded everyone that it's never too late to change, to learn, and to become a better person. One day, a young teacher approached her after a lunch session. "I was one of the students in the cafeteria that day," she revealed. "I watched everything happen, but I stayed silent. That moment taught me to never be a quiet bystander when someone needs support. Now I teach my students the same lesson." The welcome table concept had evolved in ways nobody could have predicted. Major companies had created connection corners in their offices, hospitals had healing hearts tables in their cafeterias, and airports had installed travelers' friend spots where stressed passengers could find a friendly face. A group of international students had created an app inspired by the story. It helped people find welcoming spaces in unfamiliar cities, connecting strangers through shared meals and conversations. The app's logo was a simple sunburst, like the ones painted on those original cafeteria tables. The retired superintendent, now a great-grandfather, still told the story to his great-grandchildren. But he didn't tell it as a tale of his wise leadership or his daughter's strength. He told it as a story about how everyone has the power to transform hurt into healing, judgment into understanding. Research universities had studied what they called the cafeteria effect, how small acts of kindness in shared spaces could create lasting cultural change. They found that schools that adopted similar approaches saw improvements not just in student behavior and academic performance, but in the overall health and happiness of their communities. The original high school had become something of a quiet landmark. People didn't come to take pictures or buy souvenirs. They came to sit in the cafeteria, to feel the warmth of the sun through that corner window, and to experience the special kind of magic that happens when people choose to see the best in each other. One autumn morning, a new student sat alone at the corner table, worry visible on her face. Within moments, other students joined her, sharing snacks and stories. They didn't know they were sitting at the table where it all began. They didn't need to know. They were simply living the legacy of kindness that had become as natural as breathing in that space. The superintendent's daughter had watched this scene unfold, tears warming her eyes. Her own grandchildren now attended the school, but they didn't know their grandmother was the girl from the story. To them, she was just Gran, who always reminded them that everyone deserves a seat at the table. As she left the cafeteria that day, she noticed something new. The students had started leaving small notes of encouragement on a bulletin board near the lunch line. One caught her eye. "In a world where you can be anything, be the person who makes room at their table." The story of the cafeteria incident had become more than a lesson about school culture or bullying prevention. It had become a reminder that our darkest moments can lead to our greatest light. That one person's choice to respond to unkindness with grace can echo through generations, and that sometimes the most powerful changes start with something as simple as making room at a lunch table. 30 years had passed since that moment in the high school cafeteria. The world had changed in countless ways, but the power of kindness remained timeless. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading in ways that no one could have imagined. A young filmmaker, the granddaughter of the original cafeteria worker, had created a virtual reality experience called A Seat at Every Table. Users could step into that pivotal day, feeling the emotions of everyone involved. But instead of just watching the events unfold, they could make different choices at key moments, experiencing how small actions could change everything. The superintendent's daughter, now a wise grandmother with silver hair, rarely gave speeches anymore. Instead, she hosted weekly kitchen table talks in her home, where people from all walks of life would gather to share meals and stories. Her dining room had become a place where troubled teens found mentors, where lonely elderly folks found friendship, and where strangers became family. One evening, a shy teenager came to one of these gatherings. As everyone shared dinner, she revealed that she'd been struggling at school, feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. The older woman listened, then shared her own story, not as the girl from the famous incident, but as someone who understood what it felt like to be humiliated and alone. "But here's the real magic," she told the girl, passing her a plate of warm cookies. "Sometimes the moments that hurt the most become the ones that help us grow the strongest." The original cafeteria had been preserved when the school was renovated, not as a museum, but as a living reminder of how spaces can bring people together. The sunny corner windows still streamed light onto the welcome table, now weathered by decades of elbows and lunch trays, each scratch and mark telling its own story of connection. Scientists studying community behavior had discovered something they called the ripple effect of compassion. They found that when one person experienced kindness in a shared space, they were likely to pass it on to at least 5 others within 24 hours. Those 5 would each affect 5 more, creating waves of positive change that could transform entire communities. The retired superintendent, now in his final years, spent his days writing letters to his great-great-grandchildren, sharing wisdom gained from a lifetime of learning. "The greatest power we have," he wrote, "isn't in our position or authority. It's in how we choose to treat each other in our everyday moments." Technology had changed how students ate lunch. Some schools had hovering food delivery drones and digital meal planning systems. But the core principle remained: everyone deserved a place where they felt welcome, seen, and valued. A global peace organization had adapted the story into a conflict resolution program called the Cafeteria Method. It taught people that the hardest moments, the ones filled with judgment and misunderstanding, could become bridges to deeper connection and understanding. One day, the superintendent's daughter visited a school in a distant country. Despite not speaking the language, she watched as students naturally made room for each other at their tables, shared their lunches, and looked out for anyone sitting alone. Some traditions, she realized, don't need translation. The former cafeteria worker's book had been translated into over 50 languages. But more importantly, its message had been translated into countless acts of kindness. Every time someone chose understanding over judgment, every time someone made room at their table for a stranger, the story lived on. As she watched her own great-grandchildren navigate their school years, she saw how the legacy continued. They didn't know their connection to the story, but they carried its essence in their hearts, the understanding that everyone deserves dignity, that kindness is a choice we can make every day, and that sometimes the greatest changes start with simply making room at our table. The story never really ends, she wrote in her final memoir. It lives on in every lunch table, every shared meal, every moment when someone chooses to see past differences and share their heart. We're all part of this story, writing new chapters every day with our choices. 50 years had passed since that defining moment in the high school cafeteria. The superintendent's daughter, now in her twilight years, sat in a rocking chair surrounded by her great-great-grandchildren. They had begged her to tell them a story, not knowing they were about to hear the tale that had changed countless lives. Long ago, she began, her voice soft but clear, in a school cafeteria much like yours, something happened that taught us all about the power of kindness. The world had changed dramatically in those 50 years. Schools now had advanced technology that seemed like magic to older generations. But some things remained beautifully constant. The nervous excitement of new students on their first day, the comfort of finding a friendly face in a crowded room, the simple joy of sharing a meal with others. The original cafeteria worker's great-granddaughter had become the Secretary of Education. When asked about her inspiration for implementing nationwide programs promoting emotional intelligence and community building, she would share her grandmother's story of transformation. "My grandmother taught me that it's never too late to learn, to change, and to choose kindness," she would say. Research centers around the world had studied what they now called the cafeteria principle, how shared spaces could either divide or unite people, depending on the small choices made within them. The findings showed that when people felt truly welcome in communal spaces, entire communities thrived. The old high school building had been carefully preserved, not as a monument, but as a living classroom for future generations. Every year, thousands of visitors would sit at the tables, feel the warm sunlight through the corner window, and learn how one moment of hurt had blossomed into a worldwide movement of understanding. A group of students from every continent had created a global network called Tables Without Borders. Using advanced communication technology, they connected cafeterias across the world, allowing students to share virtual lunches with peers from different cultures, breaking down barriers of distance and difference. The retired superintendent's final letter to his family, found after his passing, read, "Remember that leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge." Sometimes, the greatest victories come not from winning arguments, but from transforming them into opportunities for understanding. The story had been adapted into everything from children's books to doctoral dissertations, but its heart remained unchanged. The simple truth that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, and that kindness has the power to transform lives. One day, a young student at the original high school discovered an old plaque hidden behind some newer decorations. Dusting it off, she read, "At this table, decades ago, a moment of unkindness became a lifetime of understanding. May all who sit here remember that every day brings us chances to choose kindness." The superintendent's daughter's last public appearance was at a global peace conference. She didn't talk about programs or policies. Instead, she shared a simple meal with attendees, showing how the act of breaking bread together could break down walls between people. "The story never really ended," she told them, "because it lives on in each of us. Every time someone makes room at their table, every time someone chooses understanding over judgment, every time someone turns a moment of hurt into an opportunity for healing, the story continues." As she finished telling the tale to her great-great-grandchildren, one small voice asked, "But great-gran, how do we know if we're making the right choices?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with wisdom earned through decades of watching this story unfold. "Look for the person sitting alone. Listen to someone who seems different from you. Share what you have. Make room at your table. The right choice is usually the kind one." The sun setting outside cast the same warm glow through the windows that it had 50 years ago, reminding everyone that while times change, the power of kindness remains eternal. In cafeterias, boardrooms, and family tables around the world, people continued to write new chapters in this ever-growing story of transformation through understanding. "Remember," she whispered to her great-great-grandchildren, "you're not just hearing this story. You're part of it. Every day, you help write its next chapter with your choices." 100 years had passed since that pivotal moment in the high school cafeteria. The original school building had become a historic landmark, but not in the usual sense. Instead of being turned into a museum, it remained a living, breathing school where the spirit of kindness continued to thrive. The superintendent's daughter, the cafeteria worker, and the superintendent himself had long since passed away, but their legacy lived on in ways they never could have imagined. Their story had become part of the fabric of human kindness, taught not just in schools, but passed down through generations as a reminder of how small moments can change the world. Holographic displays now line the cafeteria walls, showing real-time connections with students in schools across the galaxy. Humanity had spread to the stars, but the need for connection remained the same. Young people from Earth would share virtual lunches with peers from distant colonies, proving that the power of sharing a meal transcended even the boundaries of space. The old welcome table had been preserved in a special corner. Though students now ate at modern tables with built-in technology, they still gravitated to this simple wooden table, drawn by its history and the warmth of the sunlight that still streamed through the corner window. A young student, descended from the original cafeteria workers' family line, discovered an ancient diary in their family archives. Reading it brought tears to their eyes. Today I learned that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest transformation. A moment of unkindness became my life's greatest lesson in compassion. The Global Tables Without Borders program had evolved into an interplanetary peace initiative. Representatives from different worlds would gather around tables, both physical and virtual, to share meals and stories, finding common ground despite their differences. Scientists studying long-term social evolution had documented what they called the 100-year ripple. They traced how one act of transformed hurt in a high school cafeteria had influenced social structures, education systems, and even space colony designs, all centered around the principle of creating welcoming spaces for connection. The story had been translated into hundreds of languages, including several non-human ones, as humanity made contact with other civilizations. The universal message of kindness and transformation resonated across species and cultures. An ancient time capsule, opened during the school's centennial celebration, contained a simple note from the superintendent's daughter. To those who find this, remember that kindness is not weakness, understanding is not surrender, and there is always room for one more at the table of humanity. The newest generation of students had developed an immersive historical experience that allowed people to feel the emotions of that pivotal day. But more importantly, they had created a network of real-time kindness monitors, not to police behavior, but to celebrate and document daily acts of compassion that kept the spirit of the story alive. On quiet afternoons, when the sun hit the cafeteria windows just right, people swore they could feel the presence of those original three people: the hurt student, the remorseful cafeteria worker, and the wise superintendent, watching over the space they had transformed. A group of peace scholars had recently published research showing how the cafeteria method of conflict resolution had prevented countless wars and conflicts over the century. The simple principle of making room at the table had grown into a fundamental approach to human relationships at every level. The story's impact could be seen in the smallest details of daily life, in the way strangers automatically made room for each other on public transport, in how communities came together during crisis, in the natural inclination of people to look out for those sitting alone. 100 years later, wrote a cultural historian, we understand that this wasn't just a story about a school cafeteria. It was about the eternal human capacity for transformation, the power of choosing kindness over revenge, and the ripple effect that one moment of grace can have across centuries. As new students entered the school each year, they became part of this living legacy. They might not have known all the details of what happened 100 years ago, but they felt its effects in the culture of kindness that surrounded them, in the natural way people looked out for each other, and in the understanding that every day brought new opportunities to choose compassion over conflict.